Hello, literature students. Today we'll be talking about liberation narratives and what that actually means. You are probably accustomed to hearing them referred to as slave narratives, but the reality is that the people who were writing them or giving their testimonies were no longer slaves. So we will choose a more appropriate way of referencing them and hopefully gain some understanding about the context under which these particular narratives became not only a record of experience in the Americas, but also in how they became a literary genre unto themselves. So let's get started. So we have a few objectives today, and this video will actually be broken into two parts. We won't be able to get through all of this in one 15-minute recording session. Don't worry, I have the weeks broken into two as well. But we are first going to have a discussion about what the diaspora actually is and how it relates to the triangular trade. And so even though this is not a history class, I've got to give you a little bit of the linguistic and the historical background so that you can understand the context. And then we'll talk about Lauda Equiano's narrative, which you guys were assigned this week, as well as Sojourner Truth's speech that was recorded, and how that connects to the overall understanding of what the African diaspora is. And then for the second half, we'll have a discussion about traditional slave narratives and those that more closely connect to what we consider to be the literary genre of a liberation narrative. And so we will have that discussion and connect it to the narratives of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, otherwise known as Linda Brent, as she wrote as in a moniker, a pseudonym. So let's go ahead and get started with part one. So the term diaspora in and of itself has a traditional meaning. When you hear the term diaspora all by itself, it is referencing the dispersal of Jewish culture throughout the world. And so diaspora is a term that specifically was crafted to represent that dispersal. And so if you think of yourself as not having an understanding of Jewish culture in any way, you actually be quite wrong. Jewish culture has been dispersed throughout the world in very clear and quantifiable ways. Some of those are linguistic. We all, even when we don't realize we do, have an understanding of some Yiddish terms, for example, and we understand what it means as far as practices and as far as expectations, not only just for faith, but also with our processes. We understand what it means to be kosher, that you want something to be clean. And so to try to understand that you have been impacted by Jewish culture, I think that it's important that we have a conversation about how these terms play into what we do in our day to day. Even when you buy products, you probably have products around your home. You don't realize it, but if you look on the back, under the ingredients and all that good stuff, a lot of your products actually have a little K in a circle. That indicates that the product itself has been processed in such a way that it meets kosher standards. And so you can try to, deny that you don't know anything about Jewish culture or that you're not impacted by Jewish culture. But again, you'd be completely incorrect. And so having said that, the term diaspora, again, in a very literal sense, means dispersal. But when we're talking dispersal, we generally mean the dispersal of Jewish culture throughout the world. But whenever you are referring to the African diaspora or the Black diaspora, you actually have to add the qualifier, right? Because now we're taking it out of just the Jewish context and putting it into a Pan-African context. And so I do also want to point out the irony. Jewish people came out of one of the stories that we are kind of all aware of is that Jewish people came out of Egypt because they were being oppressed by the pharaohs and by the Egyptians. Well, guess what? Egypt is in Africa. And so the notion of diaspora really does mean the dispersal of African culture. And so we've kind of got a duplication in the term usage. But again, for our purposes, we're going to add the qualifier African diaspora because it means more than just the culture. We're also referencing color and color politics and what many have defined as racial politics as well. And so even though linguistically you don't always have to make the distinction, for our class we're going to make the distinction so that we're making sure that we're all on the same page and within the same realm of context. Okay, so having said that, that dispersal could not happen of African culture and language and traditions. It could not have happened in the way that it happened so quickly throughout the world without the triangular trade. And so, as I say that, do not get the assumption that I am praising the triangular trade in any way, shape, or form. I am not. What I am saying is that money inspired the desire to engage in economics and become rich, capitalistic ventures, inspired what would normally have happened over perhaps several centuries or perhaps even a millennia if it had happened that way at all. And it made something that would normally not have happened very fast happen very quickly. And so as they developed systems to move through from Europe to Africa to trade in human cargo, to get raw supplies, process those supplies, and get them back to Europe to make Europeans' lives more comfortable. The triangular trade was a mechanism that made all of that happen very quickly by, all measurable ways of evaluating that. Now, when I say quickly, of course, I don't mean that they had airplanes or that they were teleporting themselves from here to there. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm saying, though, that compared to previously, when it might have taken years to make such a trek from Europe to Africa and then to either North or South America and then back to Europe. The triangular trade and the things that they developed in order to make these systems more effective and more efficient, it took several months, perhaps a year, as opposed to several years. And so what was happening is essentially that. We have the both metaphorical and figurative use of the shape of a triangle to get from somewhere in Europe, typically Great Britain or Spain or Portugal, somewhere in Europe, and you would sail to the coast of Africa, to West Africa, somewhere along the West African coast. Trade what you had, or use money, currency, to purchase people who had been enslaved. And again, we will always use the term people who have been enslaved or enslaved people, not slaves, because slaves is a definition. Being enslaved is a condition. And so we're going to talk about people's condition because they are people. But you would buy people who had been enslaved and then take them either to a destination in South America or the West Indies or North America and trade that or barter those people for something else. And then whatever that something else happened to be would be taken back to Europe, and again used to make Europeans' lives much more comfortable. And so you have a whole lot of things. This list that I have here is by no means comprehensive. You've got ores that are, metals that are being mined and taken back, spices, and if you know anything about how this started, Columbus was looking for a faster way to India. And so he was looking to have access to Indian spices. And of course, the ironies from all of that is now you've misnomed the people who were already there, called them Indians, as though you made it to India. And then on top of that, you've done all sorts of horrible things, including bringing diseases, and a truly messed up way of evaluating people and culture along with you. But the thing that came back, of course, was those exported products that had been traded for human lives. And so this, again, is by no means a comprehensive understanding of what the triangular trade did, but I wanted you to just see how this exchange influences the the understanding of Pan-African identities through the diaspora. And so not only did you do this with people, but those people have with them languages, customs, culture, practices, and values and expectations. And so when you meet African Americans in certain parts of the United States who have certain practices and certain values that are different from other African Americans, that speaks to where they came from in the diaspora and how they got to the United States in the diaspora. And so just because you see a person who is Black, as it were, you cannot assume that they all had the same experience within the diaspora. Okay. And so it's very important to have that understanding. All right. So real quick, I wanted to just explain to you what all of this means with regard to Equiano, Elauda Equiano's narrative. Equiano himself, as you read in the narrative, he was stolen along with his sister. And so that in and of itself means that he had a witness to his experience. Now, that does not mean that he and his sister ever saw each other again. We do not have any evidence of that. But what I am saying is he has a very clear memory of his life before he was enslaved. Okay. And so as he was enslaved and as he was basically traded and then pushed off from experience to experience, you saw a lot of things happening within his narrative. One of which was the fact that he was given a name initially of Jacob that he liked, and then someone else tried to change his name because they were of a different nationality to Gustavus Vasa, and he didn't like it. He wanted to become Jacob. He likes Jacob. And this in and of itself is representative not only of his conversion to those European values, but also his acceptance of his space within those values. It harkens back to the biblical story of Esau and Jacob. And so Esau was the kind brother and Jacob was the one who sinned. And so he was cursed. And so we're making the assumption that that cursed meant that he was cursed with black skin. And so Gustavus Vasa, Elauda Equiano, embraced that he was taking on the identity of Jacob. Okay. We have in his narrative the only self-written narrative by a formerly enslaved person who had been on all three continents as an enslaved person. And so his narrative is important in that regard, and in the fact that he remembers all of these experiences. And so when you look through his items, just recognize that he is a wealth of he provides a wealth of information for us with regard to experience. Now, I don't want you to get under the impression that his experience was normal. It was not. Equiano never relates any hardship. He never relates that he was hungry. He, in fact, represents all of the good things about being an enslaved person during the time frame that he is writing. But what I also want you to understand is part of that has to do with the fact that he's writing it as a man who has now benefited from it. So we're going to talk about that later in some of the narratives, but I think right now would be a good time for us to go ahead and break this video off so that we can continue this conversation with the next one.